Okay, welcome to our focus on social studies. And just like with the other units, what I've done is I've thought through the difficulties of social studies in kind of three parts. First, let's look at the language. Second, let's look at culture. And third, let's talk about some strategies that we can use to be successful with our English language learners. So this is the first part of social studies in which we're going to take a look at what makes the language of social studies challenging. Now, I like a lot of things about your social studies textbook that I've chosen for this course. And by the way, that kind of book is pretty unique. But it's obviously not written by someone with a linguistics background because they don't say much at all about the language of social studies. And so there's no reading from your textbook for this particular week. But there are lots of other things that I have for you to take a look at that will, I think, assist you even more than this lecture. So when I think about what makes the language of social studies challenging, today we're going to talk about multiple genres, multiple text patterns, changing grammar, difficult sentence structures, and vocabulary with multiple meanings. And the way I'm going to talk to you, I'm actually going to be using two things. And if you could have this one maybe printed out and have access to this one, or maybe have both of them on another screen that you take a look at the right time or pull them up. I think it'll be really helpful. What this is I lifted sentences, and now that I think about it, I should have listed the website that I took it off of. But I took this from a high school history textbook that's online. It's free access. And I took these sentences from a part of the textbook that was about indentured servants. So I tried to be kind of random about what I chose, and then what I did was I zeroed in on how do the sentences work. And I found some great examples for us to talk about, very typical about how language works in social studies textbooks. And then this is a chapter from a textbook that was used in Washington State for 5th grade social studies years ago, way before Common Core. This was actually a textbook that I used with students when I was doing push-in and pull-out social studies with 5th grade. And so it's something I'm very familiar with. I randomly chose a chapter from it, and we will use it to take a look at the shifting genres. So within this really thin chapter, does the genre change at all? Does the text patterns change at all? Okay, so I'll be drawing on those, and I'd like you to have access to those. So the first thing that you probably already realize about social studies is that it's a really interesting discipline because it's a mishmash of lots of other disciplines, right? So if you were to just randomly pick up a chapter from any age group from social studies, you would likely have, I made a list here, besides history, you might have some economics, explaining how an economic system worked at that time, or explaining how the currency worked. There might be some political science or some politics, explaining why a certain candidate had the success that she or he had, and looking at what was kind of the governing political philosophy at that time. Looking at government, there might be some government, what were the deciding structures for the culture or the society at that time? And a companion area, law, what were the laws at the time? So government is what are the mechanisms that create those laws, what are the rules, what are the things that people were held accountable for? There might also be some geography. Also, often when we are reading about people moving to a new land or the way that settlers settled in a certain area, often we are learning about the geography of the place. There might be geology. That explains a lot of movement around the world in history, people seeking out certain things, creating mines to get certain minerals and gems from the earth. Sociology, often there is a description about how groups work together, how how they formed and who had status, who didn't. Often there's archaeology. So in social studies, when we're reading about a past settlement, a past city, a group maybe that's now gone, we are often reading a little bit of archaeology. What do we think we know from the things that we have found? There's often a little bit of linguistics. So some information about a language that was used at the time and a relation, any relation that language has to another language. Sometimes there's a little bit of psychology. When you're reading about, for example, the Salem witch trials, there might be a paragraph that explains why people might have been so eager to say these things and do these things to neighbors that they lived with their whole lives and that they'd gotten along with perfectly. Anthropology often comes up. Anthropology is very much related to sociology, and it's about how cultures operate. Sociology is about groups, anthropology is about specific cultures. And often international relations. Often we're reading about the relationship between two nations to each other, and so we're reading about some international relations. So I'm sure there's more, and I bet you can even think of some additional pieces. So social studies is an amalgam of all those different genres. And often that is expressed in the readings that we put in front of students. So what does that mean for them? What does that mean? Well, most textbooks that I've seen, social studies textbooks, flip back and forth from one genre to another, often without even a heading. So you might, for example, have a section in a textbook about how explorers made their way through a certain mountain pass, and it starts out as history. And then it goes into geography, the geography of the mountains themselves, and maybe even a little bit of geology as they notice a certain mineral that's along the way. Or maybe the author is making an offhanded comment that very way there's many minerals, and 200 years later people would come to mine them, that kind of thing. So what I hope you're getting a sense is that not only do students need to be able to read across these multiple genres, but in most cases they are put in front of students and they're not labeled. And in fact, often we flip back and forth from one genre to another without even realizing it. So for a reader like you, who's mastered reading in English, you would read it, have no problem. But for an English language learner, each time the genre shifted, they would at some level notice that shift and struggle with it, or worse yet, not notice the shift. And what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that we know from discourse competence, we know that we need to have a sense of how the whole thing fits together. And we need to have a sense of what's the purpose of the writing. And what am I supposed to be taking from it? And what kinds of things will be said and what kinds of things won't be said. And if students are experiencing these shifting genres from one place to another, it's like they're operating without any tools. They don't have a sense of what the purpose of these paragraphs are, what they're supposed to be getting from them, what the relationship is between them and the author. They don't have a sense of how the ideas all hang together. And they won't really have a sense of how the multiple genres come together to tell the whole story, which is why we bring them together. We're trying to tell our story, right? And our changes depending on where you go. The textbook that I'm going to use today as an example is Our Story, meaning Washington State. And so we're always trying to tell our story, and we pull together multiple genres to do that. but we often don't announce to students. Oh, I thought of another one, biography. Biography is another genre that often shows up in different genres in social studies. Besides this kind of genre, so when I talk about genre this way, I'm kind of talking about almost disciplines, right? There's other kinds of genres that show up. I think that textbook authors, they really want to engage the readers, and they really want to bring social studies alive. These are all good things. One way they do it is they often bring in authentic texts. So they want to expose the reader to some pieces of time from that time so that it becomes a little more real to us. It kind of breathes life into it. This is great. But these other kinds of genres are sitting right next to other genres, and they're even more complexity on the page. So what kinds of things am I talking about? From looking through social studies textbooks over the year, reading them as a student myself, using them as a teacher, they often bring in old news articles. And of course, we know that news articles are written in their own kind of genre. There's an assumption that the author will attempt to be objective, and the main, most important point will usually be the first sentence of the article. And as the article goes on, the sentences are less and less important. The details are less and less important. Why? Because the author of a news article never knows where the cut will be from the editor. So you want to make sure the good stuff is near the top so it doesn't get cut. Sometimes there's poetry, short poems that are included to kind of capture a spirit of a time or to capture an important writer from that time. Sometimes there are public announcements. What were the people being told by the government at that time? Sometimes there's household ephemera. That might be a new word for you, ephemera, E-P-H-E-M-E-R-A. I love the word. Ephemera are those little paper things, usually paper, that are part of our daily life, but they're not considered very important. They kind of fly away. So, for example, the house I live in, a 1909 house, when floorboards were taken up, we found all of this ephemera under the floorboards. We found stationery from the company that the man who built the house, from his company. And we found a business card from someone who was running for office and left his card. We found other pieces of paper. And I think through a little slit and a hole that I can see a grocery store receipt. So that's another piece of ephemera. So sometimes these are included, like for example, a list of something. Maybe someone was making a list of the foods that they were going to make sure to have preserved for a long winter, to kind of capture how well prepared were the colonists at that time, that kind of thing. There might also be a persuasive essay or the text of a persuasive speech to kind of help people capture what were people trying to persuade the greater group about. Sometimes there are laws. There might be journal entries or letters. There might be ledgers or accounts. For example, I know the textbook that I used with the 5th graders when I was doing push in and pull out had a ledger that was from Lewis and Clark, the ledger kept by Lewis and Clark, to give a sense of what kinds of things were they taking with them and how much were they trading with the local Native Americans that they met. And anything else I wanted to mention? Sometimes there are advertisements or brochures to get a sense of what were people being told about a place, or what kinds of needs did people have, or what were they being told their needs were, that kind of thing. So every one of these genres is going to have a different kind of vocabulary. It's going to have a different kind of assumption about what is being expressed to the reader. It's going to have a different kind of vocabulary. For example, I mentioned history is the predominant kind of genre that shows up in social studies, and usually it's written in past tense, or present perfect, or past perfect tense, so all talking about the past. Sometimes when geology might be included, it might be written in present tense, because what was true is true. That's especially true about geography as well. Okay? And biography might be written part in past, things that have happened, but if the person is still living, then the end of the biography might be written in present tense as well, what the person is doing right now. So I hope you have a sense that it's almost like we're changing the game constantly within the writing of social studies. And unless we help students notice where those genre shifts are, how to approach them, use their discourse competence, use their sociolinguistic competence, what is appropriate to be said here, why suddenly is slang being used where it's not used in the rest of the textbook, that kind of thing. We need to support them with that. We need to support them with noticing tense shifts and think about why is the tense changing, that kind of thing. So I also have up here multiple text patterns. Now, by text patterns I mean some academic ways that we write or speak that are not just tied to a certain genre. They can occur in any academic discipline. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about compare, contrast. I'm talking about cause and effect. Talking about when we list things in a chronological order. What else did I want to mention? When we sequencing, when we're maybe saying the reasons for something, the most important reasons, and our sequencing, the number 1 is the first most important, and number 5 is the least important, that kind of thing. So multiple text patterns, they happen throughout social studies chapters. And again, just like the genres, we just slip them in there. It's not like there is a heading that says, here comes cause and effect. Remember the language of cause and effect, look for it, and what's the cause, what are the effects, that kind of thing. It just kind of sneaks up unawares on students, and it'll sneak up unaware on you as an instructor unless you analyze the language thoroughly of every social studies reading you put in front of your students. Your form of the text should be entirely marked up, where you're noticing these shifts between genres, the shift between these different kinds of documents like letters and journals and accounting kind of documents, and between these different kinds of text patterns. And just like with genres, text patterns have their own kind of language. So with compare and contrast, for example, you would expect to see words like similarly, likewise, also, both. And there are certain kinds of sentences that we use. For example, both X and Y have these things in common. And so you can, with these text patterns, not only can you prime your students, you can pre-teach or teach while they're reading or get them to notice, make sure that they understand this vocabulary of the text pattern, but you can turn that into ways that they can express the same thing. So you can put sentence stems or kind of the scaffold of sentences using this language up on the board so that they can express it as well. So that they can not just notice the compare-contrast paragraphs that you're pointing out to them in the social studies textbook, but then they can actually use that as part of their expression as well. For the multiple text patterns, I found a couple of examples. One is a great list text pattern language. The other is not only a great list of language, but it also gives you an example of what those sentence stems can look like. But those can be really powerful ways to help students get access to that language that, again, will shift within the chapter, the reading that they're doing without them even noticing. Let's take a quick look at the reading, chapter 8, just one kind of random chapter. Some things I wanted to point out to you. It starts out with history. The beginning says across the Oregon Trail. It starts out with history. Moving on to the next page, 72, we've got history. But just to point out to you, on the second page, halfway down, the author has interspersed a sentence to help students understand that a day's travel on the Oregon Trail could be done today in 15 minutes by car. So the author says the same distance would take less than 15 minutes by car on today's highways. And so that sentence is suddenly not in past tense. Everything else has been in past tense. So that's another way that we kind of shift. Moving through, it's still mostly history. And then you come to this page, and it says packing up. Now it says packing up, so we have a sense that this is a different kind of information. There's some kind of shift. Maybe it's a genre shift. But it doesn't say exactly what it is. And what this is it is a packing list from settlers on the Oregon Trail. Okay, so let's see if there's any other shifts we can notice. Here is a page called Missionaries, but the page is almost entirely devoted to talking about Marcus Whitman and Narcissa, his wife, and their demise, ultimately, near Walla Walla. And so this is an example. This is the genre of biography, but look, it's not even titled in a way that students would necessarily say biography. So if you teach them the strategy, if you see someone's name, it might be a biography. If you see their name in the heading, that wouldn't necessarily help them here. So you need to point that out. Let's take a look. Keep going through the chapter. When we turn to the next page, now what we have is we have excerpts from a woman who came across on the Oregon Trail from different days that she was on the trail. So this is the genre of a journal, a personal journal. And then we come to a time of opportunities, and this is essentially reasons why they came. Why would they go across this treacherous journey in which so many people died? And so this is kind of the text pattern of someone does something and then what were their reasons, or someone believes something and then what were their reasons. So that's a shift there. Let's keep going. Then we get to it's a series of paragraphs here in the blue. George Washington Bush. So he's an important figure from the time as well, and this is the language of biography. Now this time it has the name of a person, so students might be more likely to figure that out. But especially if you have new ELLs who are not familiar with English names, English language names, they might not recognize these as names, so you need to teach that. Anything else I want us to notice? And that is it. So that's just one random chapter, very short, and yet there it is. You see those multiple genres, the multiple text patterns, with very little kind of note to the students that those are coming. So we're not done yet talking about the difficulties that ELLs encounter in the language of social studies. We've already talked about changing grammar, but we need to talk about difficult sentence structures. Now, I've worked with 4th graders, 5th graders in social studies, and I think in general, like with this example that you have, I think in general, authors do a pretty good job at trying to keep the sentence structure simple. But once you get to middle school and high school, the sentence structures become very, very challenging. And these are the very same sentence structures your English language learners would be expected to use. And if you are preparing your English language learners to do work at a university, for example, you're working in an intensive English program, it will be very challenging, the reading. So let's take a look at the kinds of grammar issues that come up, and again, this is in your Canvas modules right above this lecture. One of the things that comes up a lot is built-in definitions. And what I mean by that are noun phrases that follow a noun that tell us a little bit more about that. So an example that I took from a reading on indentured servants for high school level, it reads as, upon completion of the contract, the servant would receive freedom dues, a prearranged termination bonus. Now, first of all, obviously the vocabulary, very, very challenging, but if you just focus at the structure, now if I'm reading this, I find the end of this sentence very, very helpful. I'm like, thank you, you gave me a definition. I don't even have to look elsewhere in the text. Right there in the sentence, you've told me a freedom due is a prearranged termination bonus. In other words, when I finish my work, I get a little something to take with me. But this is a complex level of grammar. So if a student doesn't understand what that little bit of language is, what its relationship is to the previous word, it doesn't act as a definition at all. It doesn't assist. All it does is make that sentence more complex, and they're even less likely to understand. There's another thing that shows up often as well. I have it here, lists. And here's an example I took directly from that text. Without the aid of modern machinery, human sweat and blood was necessary for the planting, cultivation, and harvesting of these cash crops. Now, for someone who has mastered English grammar, whenever we see a list and we see its parallel, it's very easy to tackle. We know that planting and cultivation and harvesting are all nouns, and they're just part of the same thing. They were all necessary. But if you haven't really tackled how lists work in English, you haven't started noticing them, and if you're still confused about what a noun can look like, because here it's two ing words and an ion word, it looks like a sentence within a sentence possibly. It looks like two verbs and a noun, and you're not really sure what that sentence within a sentence is doing. Moving on, a complex sentence, adverb clauses. And here's the example. And while I hold up my finger, this is the adverb clause. While slaves existed in the English colonies throughout the 1600s, indentured servitude was the method of choice employed by many planters before the 1680s. So we use a lot of adverb clauses in our writing of social studies. Adverb clauses they're little sentences, they're not complete sentences, they begin with an adverbial. Because, while, despite, that kind of thing. And so what the students might not recognize is the connection between these two ideas. They might read them as two completely separate sentences, and it simply becomes more complex for them. Another type of complex sentence uses adjective clauses. Here's the example. A contract was written that stipulated the length of service, typically 5 years. So a contract was written, and that stipulated the length of service is an adjective clause that actually gives us more information about contract. It's describing contract. And then we have typically 5 years, which actually describes the length of service. So what we're doing is we're adding some words that describe a previous noun then we're adding some other words that describe another previous noun. And again, for someone who's mastered reading English, we understand that. We understand that these words are describing that and these words are describing that, an adjective clause. But for students mastering English, that can be quite complex. So that would be something you would want to point out to them. And finally, the last thing I want to mention about the challenging grammar, the sentence structure that they encounter, is what we call text cohesion. Every language, when people are speaking or when they're writing, every language has ways of connecting ideas, of kind of like pointing back what I just said. In English, one predominant way that we do that is through pronoun reference. I might say, Bill went to the store, he bought a chicken. Bill and he refer to the same person. As you hear me speak, you don't think there's two people, Bill and he. You recognize that he refers back to Bill. So that's pronoun reference. We also use noun reference. So we use it a lot, for example, in newspaper articles. You might read something like, Bill Smith had an accident last night. Smith ran into a pole. The man is injured and now in Sacred Heart, that kind of thing. So the man refers back to Smith, and Smith refers back to Bill Smith. So that's noun reference. So we use it a lot in social studies textbooks. So here's an example taken again from the paragraph that I took from a social studies textbook on indentured servants. So listen along, and I'll raise my finger each time there is an example of reference, noun reference or pronoun reference. A contract was written that stipulated the length of service, typically 5 years. The servant would be supplied room and board while working in the master's fields. Upon completion of the contract, the servant would receive freedom dues, a prearranged termination bonus. This might include land, money, a gun, clothes, or food. On the surface, it seemed like a terrific way for the luckless English poor to make their way to prosperity in a new land. Beneath the surface, this was not often the case. Once you've mastered reading in English, as you read pronouns and nouns that refer backwards, you so quickly make meaning that you don't realize what you're doing. It would be impossible to understand that paragraph if you didn't understand what the nouns and pronouns were referring back to. So that's just a perfect example, actually. It was kind of random, but a perfect example of text cohesion that makes reading and social studies really difficult. And the final thing I want to mention around what makes the language of social studies challenging is vocabulary with multiple meanings. Now, right now, some of your classmates are learning about the language of math. And one thing I heavily emphasize in their lecture is that multiple meanings of mathematics terms is a huge problem. It's a problem in social studies too, but not to the degree it is in mathematics. But there are terms that students will be exposed to in social studies, and it's very likely they've already been exposed to, they've already learned, and they already have a different meaning associated with it. Let's say, for example, you're learning about the U.S. government structures, and you're talking about a house. House, 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 house. Well, your students already, I guarantee it, have a sense of what house means in English. That's one of the first few words that comes up for language learners. So they already have a sense of that, but that's not the house that you mean. And believe it or not, that will actually interfere with meaning unless you address it, unless you help students understand, okay, here's some new words we're going to look at today, and you might already, for these, you might already have a meaning. What does house mean? Oh yeah, that place you live. Yep, that's what it means. But today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about house meaning this. Another example, if you're reading about a battle, using the word front, right? So there's the front of a book, the back of a book, the front of a house, the back of a house. But when you're talking about battles, front means something completely different, right? So those are just a few examples. So one thing to be on the lookout for as you're pre-reading, before you assign a social studies text to your students, look for any vocabulary that not only are new, but more importantly, are not new. They come to you already with meanings in place, but you need to address that and help them know, absolutely, that is what house means, but today we're going to add a new meaning for social studies, okay? So what I hope is that you have a really good framework now, a sense of all the linguistic challenges that your students are going to experience when you put social studies readings in front of them. Whether they're in a textbook or an informal reading, they're likely to experience. Where do I want you to go from here? Like I mentioned, there is no place in your textbook that up to my kind of expectations does a great job of talking about language. So I've chosen some very brief readings for you to take a look at that look at the difficulties of social studies for students around language. One of the readings kind of addresses, it talks about some linguistic challenges. It also talks a little bit about culture. It also talks a little bit about strategies, but it mentions some language difficulties, and so I wanted to include that. And as I mentioned, there's some text pattern websites that I want you to take a look at as well. So, meet us in the discussion and let's talk about what we see of the language of social studies in our text example. Okay, meet you there.